All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are unpacking a truly fascinating, completely sprawling commentary that attempts to map out the architecture of a modern global crisis. Now, this commentary presents a worldview that connects some seemingly unrelated threads. We're going to explore exactly how this source material links modern nuclear strategy, the wild complexities of domestic oil production, and, believe it or not, 18th century pirates, all into one massive overarching thesis about the current state of global affairs. It's a complex narrative for sure, but that's exactly why we're going to break it down step by step. To make sense of this sprawling argument impartially, we've broken the source's worldview down into 5 main pillars: the strangest war, the nuclear tipping point, energy and the economy, geopolitical proxy conflicts, and finally, a rather surprising Barbary pirates parallel. Starting off with Section 1, the strangest war, a conflict without commitment. So what's really interesting here is how the source frames our current global situation. It suggests we're essentially in the middle of a strange, uncommitted war. Nobody wants troops on the ground, and frankly, nobody wants another 20-year endless conflict. But underlying all of this hesitation, the source argues, is the ultimate driving fear of a nuclear-armed Iran. To illustrate this, the source looks at former President Donald Trump's mindset. They highlight his quote, "Get up, you want to represent the United States of America, you're not afraid, we don't cower to anybody," to capture his defiant reaction to being shot. The commentary argues that while Trump fears absolutely nothing in a conventional sense, he is uniquely, profoundly terrified of one specific scenario: nuclear war. They point out that in every single military war game run since the 1950s, the introduction of even one tactical nuke always spirals out of control, inevitably ending in total human annihilation. And that, according to the source, is the only thing that truly frightens him. Moving on to Section 2, the nuclear tipping point, and why deterrence fails. Let's unpack the core anxiety of this commentary: the belief that traditional nuclear deterrence just will not work with Iran. To understand why, we have to look back at mutually assured destruction, or MAD. You know, the classic Cold War strategy where any full-scale use of nukes basically guarantees the complete annihilation of everybody involved. The source points out that MAD actually worked brilliantly as a deterrent with adversaries like Russia and China. Why? Because at the end of the day, the leaders of those nations fundamentally did not want to die. They had a basic self-preservation instinct that made the threat of mutual destruction highly effective. And this is where the source draws a really stark contrast regarding Iran. Take North Korea, for example. The source argues that even though the North Korean leadership acts completely erratic, they ultimately want to live, and they are effectively kept in check by China. But the source views the Iranian leadership entirely differently. The commentary literally describes them as a death cult, operating on this twisted religious vision, believing they are actively hastening the return of a promised one. According to this analysis, that specific mindset makes them completely immune to the logic of mutually assured destruction. I mean, think about it. If your adversary isn't afraid of dying, the entire concept of a deterrent just vanishes. Which brings us to Section 3, energy and the economy, the domestic choke point. So how exactly does this terrifying nuclear threat thousands of miles away hit your wallet? Well, the source posits a very specific, catastrophic scenario. If Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, they could effectively choke off the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the world's absolute most critical oil arteries. If that happens, the source argues we could easily see oil prices skyrocket to $120, maybe $130 a barrel. And we aren't talking about a temporary little spike at the pump. The analysis warns that sustained oil prices at that level wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would trigger a global economic disaster on the scale of the Great Depression, dragging down the US, China, Russia, and Europe along with it. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, doesn't the US drill plenty of its own oil? Actually, yes, but the source outlines this fascinating sequence to explain what they call the US oil paradox. While America pulls tons of light sweet crude out of the ground, our existing refineries are actually built to process heavy crude. And get this, we haven't built a single new refinery in the United States since the 1970s. The source argues this is due to intense environmental resistance, plus the fact that major banks simply won't finance them because they fear the facilities will never actually be allowed to open. Because of this bottleneck, the U.S. is forced into this bizarre loop where we export our own raw crude and then completely rely on places like the Middle East to send us back refined gasoline and diesel. It is a massive, glaring structural vulnerability. All right, on to Section 4, geopolitical proxy conflicts, the invisible escalation.
Building heavily on that economic vulnerability, the commentary shifts here to look at how the major world powers are operating in the shadows of this tension. According to the source, China is actively providing drones and targeting assistance to adversaries, while Russia is deepening its partnership with Iran, just sort of inching their way into the conflict. But here's the real catch. The source notes the U.S. cannot strike back at these nations directly. Retaliating against China, for example, carries the massive risk of literally triggering World War III. Furthermore, the source points out a level of geopolitical hypocrisy here, noting that the U.S. is doing the exact same thing by providing weapons and targeting assistance against Russia over in Ukraine. It's this massive invisible escalation where direct, face-to-face confrontation is completely off the table. Because direct war between these superpowers is unthinkable, the source suggests the current strategy is essentially, well, hoping for a miracle from the inside. The analysis relies on some intense historical metaphors, calling it the search for an Albert Speer or a Valkyrie scenario. Just as there were historical figures and secret plots attempting to stop Nazi Germany from within, the commentary suggests the primary hope right now is that an inside actor in Iran might somehow overthrow the radical leadership just to signal to the world that they don't actually have a death wish.
And finally, Section 5, the Barbary Pirates Parallel, Echoes of the First Foreign War.
This is where the source draws a direct and frankly wild line from today's incredibly complex Middle East tensions all the way back to America's very first foreign war. It dives into a fascinating historical anecdote about the U.S. Marines. Now, you probably know they are famously nicknamed the Leathernecks. Well, the source details that this name originated because early Marines literally had to wear thick 4 to 5 inch leather collars around their necks. Why? Simply to protect themselves from having their heads severed by the swords of Muslim Barbary pirates during this early conflict. And that leads to a truly staggering historical claim. According to the commentary, at the time, these Barbary pirates were just indiscriminately attacking global shipping, taking cargo, taking slaves, demanding massive ransoms. The situation was so severe that between a third and two-thirds, we're talking up to 66% of the early United States federal budget, was spent entirely on bribing these pirates just to leave American ships alone. And it wasn't just the US. France, England, Spain, they were all paying these massive extortion fees too.
To tie this historical conflict right back to the modern day, the source brings up a quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson at the end of that very war. He said, "I warn you, read their words, they're not going to change. Our first foreign war, if we don't pay attention, will end up being our last foreign war." The source uses Jefferson's warning to essentially frame modern Islamic extremism as an unchanging historical threat. The argument here is that the fundamental dynamic, an adversary that views itself as entirely righteous and everyone else as infidels, literally has not shifted since the days of those Barbary pirates.
So, based on the structured, highly complex worldview we've just unpacked in this explainer, all the way from the failure of nuclear deterrence to those crazy domestic oil vulnerabilities to the echoes of 18th century pirates, the video leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to consider. Will our first foreign war end up being our last? It's a heavy thought to sit with, and whether you agree with the source's mapping of these geopolitical pillars or not, it undeniably provides a fascinating lens through which to view the architecture of a modern global crisis. Thanks so much for tuning into this explainer, and we'll see you next time.